Hello and welcome to part 2 of our documentary on the rise of the European Union from the perspective of Franco-Spain. Last time we watched how that country was founded with the restoration of the French Carlist monarchy and their subsequent union with Spain after the monarchist victory in the Civil War helped by French troops. Meanwhile, the resurgent Germany took control of most of Eastern Europe, with its unopposed invasions in Poland, Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia, leading to the formation of the Axis powers, with Franco-Spain, Germany and Japan, with its Russian puppet, were forming the world's largest superpower. And now, in October 1940, the Axis powers were ready for the next stage of their European expansion. The last major power that could threaten them in the Mediterranean was Italy, and battle plans were being drawn for the invasion. Meanwhile, Germany was planning her own invasion of Britain, though that was scheduled for later in the year. The United Kingdom was seen as the largest threat to the Axis on the global stage, as the Commonwealth still stood behind Britain, including the newly fascist Canada, and the Commonwealth powers were supported with an alliance with America. Having captured and executed a British spy the previous year, the French government decided to found its own intelligence agency, the 12e Bureau, but this would receive little funding throughout the early years of the Great War. With battle plans drawn up and the pretext to invasion already established, on the 27th of October 1940, Franco-Spain declared war on Italy and was immediately joined by the rest of the Axis powers. The opening phase of the war would end up being a sign of the dire days to come, as no sooner had Germany declared war on Italy than forward German commanders preparing a naval invasion pointed out to the Führer that an Italian exclave was directly nearby and contained armoured units. At the same time, King Alphonse of Spain reminded the Germans that Albania had been occupied by the Italians, who had stationed a large army there, poised to invade the recently captured Yugoslavia, to which the German High Commander reportedly replied, "Oh, bollocks," a quote which will go down in history as one of the greatest of the Second Great War. In the north of Italy, however, the Franco-Spanish units did advance with quite some success. Despite the Italians having fortified their positions in the Alps, they were quite stunned to find French heavy tanks crossing the mountain passes, including the brand new ARL-classed heavy tank, made with improvements to the previous B1 with the fitting of a third turret. The heavy howitzers made short work of the Italian defensive fortifications and allowed Franco-Spanish infantry divisions to cross. Not to be outdone by her Western allies, the Empire of Japan finally declared war on mainland China, thus turning the phony Sino-Japanese War into a real bloody conflict. However, on the 29th of October 1940, only 2 days after the Franco-Spanish troops had crossed the border into Italy, disastrous news reached the desk of King Alfonso. Italy had joined the Allies, and the United Kingdom immediately responded with a declaration of war. The entire Commonwealth and the United States of America were now at war with the Axis powers, and truly the Second Great War had just begun. This immediately sent shockwaves through the Axis military high command. Germany cancelled her invasion of Italy, and Franco-Spain immediately redeployed her light tank army, which had been ready in northern France to support any potential invasion. The new threat was Gibraltar, where Britain had secretly landed large numbers of troops, ready to invade the Spanish mainland. The French navy, suddenly aware that it was now at war with the world's greatest naval power, moved swiftly in the Mediterranean, and first blood went to the Franco-Spanish, with the destruction of a destroyer off the coast of Italy. At the same time, the African divisions quickly advanced, with Franco's Spanish troops barely opposed by the handful of Italians. In a growing sign of things to come, America and Canada quickly responded to the war by seizing all French colonies in the Americas. Axis commanders had already planned for a potential invasion of Britain. Now the schedule was moved up significantly. Phase 1 was establishing complete naval superiority of the English Channel. Knowing that the Axis could not face the British Navy, it was decided that air superiority must be established, and thousands of German naval bombers had been in production from as early as 1936. Fleets of these bombers, supported by their Franco-Spanish counterparts, took to the skies above the Channel, bombing any and all British vessels in that region. These were supported by the fighters of the Luftwaffe and the heavy Baguette-class interceptor fighters of the French Royal Air Force. Britain and America quickly responded by sending their own planes into the region. The Battle of the English Channel had begun. On the ground war, French troops crossed rapidly through the Western Alps. The King's Guard, veterans of the Spanish Civil War, pushed through and moved on Genoa and Milan, with the Italians not able to counter. Equally in Africa, Tripoli was surrounded and several Italian divisions were captured. In the east, the stalemate that had become the Japanese-Chinese War was broken, as Manchuria declared her independence, suddenly cutting off the Japanese forward units from their supply lines. Rather inexplicably to historians even to this day, Manchurian units rose up all across the Japanese Empire, most notably in her puppet of Russia. This led to the Russian forces spending much of the early months of the war putting down Manchurian insurgents all across the Russian Empire. Meanwhile, in the Mediterranean, between the French Navy and the mass of Luftwaffe torpedo bombers, both Italian and British ships were being sunk en masse. A victory at sea that was matched by a victory at land, as the King's Guard, having pushed across northern Italy, managed to surround 10 Italian divisions, while in Spain the arrival of the light tank divisions helped push back the British initial gains to a small pocket around Gibraltar. Russia provided its own assistance to the war with the deployment of the Black Sea Fleet into the Mediterranean. They passed through the Straits of the Bosphorus, through much acclaim by their Turkish allies, and then proceeded to harass Italian and British shipping throughout the eastern and western Mediterranean. The French military, however, suddenly realized that their oil stockpiles were dwindling. Initial confusion of this was soon answered when it was found that America had stopped her shipments of oil upon declaration of war, something that the French High Command had apparently not anticipated. Hurriedly diplomats approached Romania and Azerbaijan to pick up the shortfall, and before long the stockpiles of fuel were once again rising. By the 8th of December 1940, the last British troops in the Gibraltar pocket were completely surrounded and surrendered soon thereafter. However, the initial glory days of Franco-Spanish involvement in the war were coming to an end. In North Africa, overstretched supply lines led to a stalling of the attack, only a few miles short of the port of Benghazi. Exhausted troops, unable to keep up the assault, were simply unable to take the port which was to be their refueling lifeline. The African War became a stalemate. In the Middle East, British troops had pushed through Syria and were now at the Turkish border. Turkey, having already deployed much of its army elsewhere, called on its allies for help. Germany responded by pulling back its troops on the Albanian border. This, however, led to disaster, as the Romanian troops sent to relieve them were of poor quality and were rapidly pushed back, with Italian troops recapturing all of the lost territory in the region and establishing a firm foothold on the borders of Yugoslavia. And in contrast with the victories being won in the Mediterranean, the French Atlantic Fleet took a horrific beating, with all French patrol fleets being destroyed by the Royal Navy. The Battle of the Channel continued with a violent air campaign, with America, Britain, France and Germany pouring planes into the region. And then, to reinforce the impending sense of doom in the Axis High Command, just before New Year, the Americans reached the Mediterranean. Troops flooded to the Allied holdings in Albania, Italy and North Africa, and American ships began aggressively patrolling and hunting down their French foes. As 1941 dawned, the new year brought with it new hope for the embattled Axis powers. The battered RAF and US Air Force pulled back from the Channel, giving the Axis powers complete air supremacy and leading to the mass destruction of Allied shipping. However, the battered French Atlantic Navy withdrew from the Atlantic. Without enough patrols, the main strike force withdrew and joined the Mediterranean fleet. Wanting to put a quick end to the Mediterranean conflict, French troops enacted a breakthrough across Italy. Hoping to replicate their successes in the Spanish Civil War, they pushed rapidly through the Italian country. The initial spearhead would soon find itself in trouble. However, it did force Italians to pull back from the front line. This led the bulk of the French army to quickly be able to seize Rome and encircle a large number of Italian divisions. Germany, meanwhile, took steps to secure the Baltic by invading Denmark on the 7th of January. Russia, meanwhile, finished mopping up pockets of insurgents and started moving its vast army eastward towards the Chinese front. On the 11th of January, the French Mediterranean fleet hailed its greatest victory. The Italian navy had been forced to flee Rome while still under repairs, and had been quickly caught by the Royal French Navy. This led to the destruction of multiple ships, including the Italian flagship, the Caio Diulo. Italian dominance in the Mediterranean was well and truly over. All was not well for the Franco-Spanish, though, as the spearhead troops that had done such a good job distracting the Italians were suddenly surrounded. 5 divisions found themselves isolated in the toe of Italy. These divisions would put up a stiff resistance, for months fighting on their own while hoping for a breakthrough that would never come. All 5 divisions would eventually surrender or be destroyed entirely. To mitigate these losses, Turkey sent several divisions of expeditionary troops to be commanded by the Franco-Spanish. These were immediately sent to reinforce German divisions operating in the Levant, and together these rapidly pushed the British forces back across Syria and into British-occupied Palestine. As the Regia Marina continued to suffer defeat after defeat, with its ships forced to flee from port to port, getting attacked continuously, the German High Command took this opportunity to declare war on the Russian breakaway states, beginning with the invasion of the Ukraine. This invasion, however, caused much panic amongst the unprepared Russian military high command, who, having not been told of the war, had not prepared any troops. This resulted in Ukrainians making many surprise victories against the numerically superior Russians, an embarrassment for the Russian dictator indeed. Meanwhile, enough control had been gained over the Channel for Operation Sea Lion to go ahead. German troops would cross the Channel under protection of the German High Seas Fleet. This would result in one of the bloodiest naval engagements of the Great War, where the German High Seas Fleet engaged the Royal Navy. 2 German battleships engaging 6 British battleships, 3 British battlecruisers, and 4 carriers. In the resulting conflict, even with aid from land-based air units, the German High Seas Fleet was devastated. Both battleships were lost, and only a few destroyers managed to escape. Their sacrifice, however, would not be in vain, as the Royal Navy contended with the German battleships. The German transports made their way safely, establishing a beachhead in Britain. On the 21st of January 1941, the first German units came ashore. As these initial pioneer units took London, the entire Franco-Spanish light tank army landed to reinforce them. Britain, having committed most of her army overseas, quickly found herself outnumbered, and the few British Home Guard divisions were completely outclassed by the veteran Franco-Spanish light tanks. These divisions raced from city to city, and Birmingham, Cardiff, Liverpool all fell within days. By the 14th of February, the British government had no choice but to capitulate, the British royal family fleeing to fascist Canada. The war for the Allies in the Mediterranean was also going poorly, as the last remnants of the Regia Marina, attempting to guard vital troop supplies to their forces in North Africa, were intercepted by the French High Seas Fleet, 25 destroyers being destroyed in a single engagement. At the same time, although the King's Guard were unable to break through to rescue the encircled Spearhead Division, they did manage in encircling several Italians. As the French light tank divisions pulled back to northern France to defend against any American invasions, further victories were won by the Axis in the east, with King China finally capitulating, having been overrun by the mass of Russian divisions. Despite the victories, the war had taken its toll on the French, with all French manpower having been depleted by 15th February, leading to there simply being not enough troops to be brought into the newly trained divisions. As France grappled with how to reinforce her dwindling manpower, good news started to pour in. On the 22nd of February, the Italians finally surrendered, having put up a much stronger fight than the British. A week later, Ukraine capitulated, followed swiftly by Denmark. To all the world, it seemed as if Europe was falling under the Axis. One last thorn remained, however, before Axis domination of the Mediterranean could be complete: the Allied holdings in North Africa. With the assistance of the American divisions, the Italians had started to push the French-Spanish troops back through Tunisia, and hurriedly the construction of a railway across Tunisia was begun. In Palestine, however, the Axis powers had pushed the Allies back to a thin strip of land along the coast, and quickly reacted by pushing in to establish an encirclement. French divisions, freed up from the Italian campaign, moved to Albania to help the Germans and the Romanians push out their troops. But the Italians, supported by the Americans, clung on bitterly to their small corner of the Balkans. But with Beirut and then the entirety of Palestine cut off, the war in the eastern Mediterranean was finally swinging in the favour of the Axis powers. In an effort to alleviate the extreme supply shortages on the Tunisian front, half of the Franco-Spanish African army was redeployed to West Africa, where the Turks had been steadily being pushed back by American troops. And in May, sick of the Franco-Spanish codes being repeatedly broken, finally a cryptography department was established, with the goal of trying to create a code more simple than writing the letters backwards. In the Pacific theatre, to get around their deadlock in China, Japan launched a series of naval invasions, capturing Manila on the 15th of May, and the Philippines would capitulate a month later. Germany, meanwhile, continued its operations in mopping up the Soviet Union's breakaway states with a lightning invasion of Belarus, taking the Belarusians by complete and utter surprise, capitulating them in mere days. A victory whose ease was only a prelude to the German invasion of Ireland, where they found only a single enemy division, poorly equipped, to face them. In America, the Bolivarian Alliance was now formed from several South American countries led by the communist Mexico. These would play a major part in the war to come, as we will see in the next episode. For now, Germany began to push across the Atlantic, starting with Iceland. Although Iceland had declared independence upon the fall of Denmark, Germany declared war all the same, landing troops and capturing the city of Reykjavik to use as a staging post for her push westward. France, meanwhile, started to decentralize government, releasing multiple colonies under provisional governments, most notably those in Indochina, in order to provide their own troops to help push back against the British Raj and Chinese forces. In further efforts to alleviate manpower issues, conscription was increased, but this only exacerbated the worker shortfall. Still, with a surplus of many forms of equipment, King Alphonse decided that more bodies were needed to bring an end to the Allies. Franco-Spanish troops then began to mop up the remains of resistance within the Mediterranean, starting with the landings of Sardinia and Corsica, which would be followed by landings in Malta and Cyprus. Germany, meanwhile, used Icelandic ports to invade Greenland, bringing her within striking distance of the North American continent. In Tunisia, however, the Franco-Spanish troops had been pushed back. The good news for the commanders on the ground was that they had been pushed back so far they were once again within established supply lines, and now it was the Allies who found themselves struggling to supply troops in the desert. By the 14th of October, only little progress had been seen on the Chinese front, with Russian and Japanese landings securing some of the coastline but being unable to push inland. In an attempt to establish a better and more cohesive defense, Long Yun took power in China. The other major stalemate to Axis advance was Albania, which was still holding on bitterly. To attempt to alleviate this, in November, Germany declared war on Greece. With a new front opened, the Axis forces were finally able to push back and surround the holdouts in Albania. On the naval front, the battered but victorious French Navy turned attention to potential future conflicts. With the success of the ARL, what was often being dubbed the land battleship, the French Navy decided it needed its own grand sea battleship. And thus the La Grande began construction, a true modern heavy battleship that would dominate the wars to come. Bristling with anti-air defences to put an end to any American carriers, she carried good, heavy, high-caliber naval cannons to make her a master of the seas. High off their recent series of lightning conquests, German military began their invasion of Sweden. This, however, would prove a much harder nut for the Germans to crack, as Swedish troops quickly massed to the fjords crossings and stalled the German advance. But by the end of November and the start of December 1941, the war in the Mediterranean was swinging well in the direction of the Axis. Albania finally fell to the advancing Franco-Spanish troops, and the Greece defenders were rapidly collapsing upon the onslaught of the Wehrmacht. Meanwhile, Alphonse revealed his greatest play to date. The slow retreat in Tunisia had not in fact been a blunder, was by logistical oversights, but had been a masterstroke, as the King's Guard, having practiced landings across other sites in the Mediterranean, now launched twin attacks into Tobruk and Benghazi. Within days, they had seized both ports and had pushed through to the edge of the Sahara Desert, massively encircling the Allied North African armies. 9 British and American divisions were encircled in Tunisia, and the Franco-Spanish troops mopped up resistance and marched through, capturing El Alamein. To their east, there was another breakthrough. With Palestine finally eliminated, the German troops pushed west and seized the Suez. Allied resistance in Africa was coming to a swift and decisive end. And then, as the sun rose on the 1st of January 1942, the war entered its next phase. German troops landed in Canada. The Great War had reached the shores of the New World. But for that, you will have to wait until next time, where we will continue to see the rise of the European Union, as European troops battle across America in some of the bloodiest and darkest conflicts to come. For now, I have been Dr. J. Ebus, and this has been a brief summary of the rise of the European Union. Thank you, and good day.